The child had been seizing for 4 minutes when the monitors started screaming. 3 senior physicians were in the building. None of them had reached him yet. The boy's mother, one of the most powerful women in the country, a woman who commanded boardrooms and bent markets to her will, stood at the corridor's edge and felt, for the first time in 20 years, completely helpless. And then a man in a janitorial uniform dropped to his knees beside her son. What she didn't know, what nobody in that corridor knew, was that the hands reaching for her child had held a scalpel in over 400 operating rooms across 3 continents. Stay right here with me. This is the story of what those hands remembered. The night Nora Caldwell's world came apart, she was still running it. That was the thing about Nora. She didn't stop. Not when the quarterly earnings dipped, not when the board moved against her, not when her husband left and took half of everything she'd built. She had always believed that the answer to any problem was more work, more speed, more control. She had built Caldwell Capital into a $23 billion enterprise through sheer refusal to accept the word no. 3 acquisitions in 2 years. A restructuring that analysts said couldn't happen and that she made happen in 11 months. A reputation that made other CEOs return her calls on the first ring, because you never wanted to be on Nora Caldwell's second call list. She was 44 years old. She was running at full speed. And she had not, until that October night, understood that some things run faster than you. It was a Tuesday. Her son James was 7. He had his father's eyes and her stubbornness and a laugh that could fill a whole room without trying. He had been complaining of headaches for 2 weeks. Her assistant had scheduled the pediatric appointment. Her driver had taken James while she closed a deal in Singapore on the phone from the back of her car. She'd thought it was nothing. She had been certain it was nothing, because certainty was what she dealt in. The call came at 8:47 in the evening. The pediatric neurologist's voice was careful and even, the voice of a person trained to deliver information to parents who were about to stop breathing. Mrs. Caldwell, James is stable. But we found something on the imaging. I'd like you to come in. She came in. The MRI was spread across 3 screens in the consultation room, gray and white shapes that she couldn't read, but that the doctor navigated with a stylus, tracing corridors and masses and measurements she'd never needed to learn before. Arteriovenous malformation. The word sat in the air like something that had been waiting its whole life to land. A tangle of blood vessels in the brain. Not a tumor, not a clot, something more complicated. A structural problem, a design flaw that James had been living with since before he was born. The headaches were a warning. The fact that it hadn't ruptured yet was luck. How do we fix it? Nora asked. Surgery, the doctor said. But there are complications. The location makes it high risk. We'd recommend a specialist. I want the best, she said. Whatever it costs, whoever it is. Get me the best. She meant it the way she always meant things, completely, without reservation, as a statement of fact about how the world would now arrange itself. The world did not arrange itself quickly enough. The next 3 weeks were the kind that change people. Nora had always operated on the assumption that money could solve any problem given enough velocity. She called specialists in Boston, in Houston, in Zurich. She flew a pediatric neurovascular surgeon in from London for a consultation that cost her $14,000 for 6 hours of his time. She retained 2 different law firms to advise on medical malpractice protections and patient advocacy, because she was Nora Caldwell, and she prepared for everything. What she was not prepared for was the answer she kept getting. The AVM was deep, deeply placed in the left hemisphere, close to structures that controlled language and motor function. The surgical risk of paralysis was significant. The surgical risk of cognitive damage was significant. One specialist put it directly: the risk of the surgery may exceed the risk of careful monitoring. Nora didn't accept careful monitoring as an answer. What about the boy on the monitor? She pushed back. What about the one who has a seizure in his sleep? What about the one who doesn't wake up? The doctors nodded. They understood. They presented alternatives, radiosurgery, embolization as a precursor, staged approaches over years, long timelines, conservative strategies. Nothing that felt like the kind of decisive action Nora had built her whole life around. She fired 2 of them, hired 3 more. The new ones said similar things in different vocabularies. James, through all of this, was James. He did not know how afraid his mother was. She made sure of it. She sat with him at bedtime and read the same books they'd always read, dragon stories and space stories, and a chapter book about a boy who discovers a door in the back of his closet. She kept her voice even. She kept her face calm. She was, in this as in all things, expert at concealing the mechanism behind the output. Only at night, alone in the kind of silence that only very large, very empty houses can produce, did she let herself feel the size of what was happening. She was losing. For the first time in her adult life, she was losing something she couldn't outwork, or outspend, or outmaneuver. Her son was sick, and all her money and all her power had bought her a room full of doctors who kept saying the same terrifying thing in polished professional language. We don't recommend surgical intervention at this time. Harrington Medical Center was Nora's 3rd choice, and her best one. Dr. Pauline Garrett ran the pediatric neurology wing there. She had published more papers on AVM management in children than anyone in the country. She was 61, small, precise, with the quiet authority of someone who had spent 40 years proving they belonged in every room they walked into. She looked at James's imaging for 20 minutes without speaking. She said, "This is difficult." Nora said, "Everything is difficult. What can you do?" "Doctor," Garrett looked at her, not unkindly, but without flinching. "We can manage this. We can monitor, medicate for seizure prevention, watch the pressure measurements, and intervene if something changes. Surgery remains on the table as an option, but the current calculus doesn't favor it." "What changes the calculus?" "An event." She said it simply. "If the AM ruptures or bleeds, we reassess immediately. The anatomy in an acute scenario is sometimes more favorable for intervention. You're telling me to wait for something bad to happen so you can help him." "Doctor," Garrett held her gaze, "I'm telling you that right now, the greatest protection we can offer him is careful, consistent monitoring and seizure management." She paused. "I know that's not what you came here for." It wasn't. Nora admitted James to Harrington Medical for a 3-day monitoring period. She got him settled in a room on the 4th floor of the pediatric wing, installed his stuffed giraffe on the pillow beside him, told him this was an adventure and that the food was probably terrible, and that she was going to eat it with him and complain together. James thought that was funny. She sat with him until he fell asleep. Then she went out into the corridor and stood very still, her back against the wall, and tried to remember the last time she had felt completely powerless. She couldn't find it. Not since she was 8 years old, standing in a different kind of hospital, waiting for different news. She had made a decision at 8 years old that she would never stand in a corridor like this again, waiting for someone else to determine what happened to the people she loved. She had not kept that promise. The corridor smelled like antiseptic and floor wax. A cart rolled past, pushed by a man in a gray uniform. He was tall, quiet moving, somewhere in his late 30s. He glanced at her briefly, not intrusively, just noticing, and pushed the cart around the corner and disappeared. She didn't give him a second thought. His name was Daniel Reyes, and he had been pushing that cart for 11 months. Before the cart, there had been a great many other things. There had been 8 years of medical school, residency, fellowship. There had been 4 years at Johns Hopkins as an attending neurosurgeon, then 6 more at a specialized center in Barcelona that handled some of the most complex vascular cases in Europe. There had been a particular area of expertise, pediatric AVM surgery, the very thing that had been drawing him toward operating rooms since his first year of residency, when he'd watched a child come back from something impossible and understood, with absolute clarity, what he was for. There had also been an accident. On an ordinary Wednesday 2 years ago, Daniel had been driving home from a 20-hour shift. He'd fallen asleep at a red light, which he had done before, which most surgeons did more often than they admitted. But this time the light turned green, and his foot slipped from the brake. The collision was minor by any external measure. No one was seriously hurt. But the other car had spun, and the driver had fractured his wrist, and the driver turned out to be connected to a man connected to the hospital's board, and the investigation that followed was thorough and precise and ended Daniel's surgical privileges pending review. The review had concluded 4 months later that Daniel was fit to practice. The board had reinstated him on paper, but the chief of surgery, who had never particularly liked Daniel, had used the intervening months to restructure the department in ways that left no position for him. And the reinstatement had come with a conditional return that had conditions impossible to meet without a position. A loop with no exit that Daniel had spent 8 months trying to navigate through lawyers and appeals and conversations that went nowhere. He had a daughter, Emma. She was 5. She lived with her mother in Pasadena, and Daniel was in New York, and the arrangement was already strained before the accident, and afterward it had become something he did not have a word for, not quite broken, but bent in ways he could not bend back. He needed income. He needed to stay in New York near the appeal process. He needed, in the language his attorney used, to demonstrate stability. So he had taken the facilities position at Harrington Medical. It was not lost on him, the particular shape of the irony. He walked the same corridors where surgery happened. He passed or suites he could have entered as a surgeon and entered now only to mop. He heard pages and codes and discussions in the language he had spent a decade learning, and he said nothing, because what was there to say? Emma would visit in 3 weeks. That was what he held on to. He cleaned the corridors. He fixed the things that broke. He showed up at 6 in the morning and stayed until things were done. His supervisor, a man named Carl, who ran facilities with the quiet dedication of someone who understood that hospitals ran on invisible labor, had told him after 4 months that he was the best hire he'd made in 5 years. Daniel had thanked him sincerely, and meant it, and gone back to work. He did not tell people what he had been. He did not explain why he noticed things, the way a patient's color had shifted, the particular sound of certain monitors, the posture of a family in a waiting room that said emergency rather than routine. He noticed. He kept walking. It was not his place. And then on a Thursday night in October, in the 4th floor corridor of the pediatric wing at Harrington Medical Center, everything changed. It started the way most disasters start, quickly and with no warning. Daniel was restocking supplies in the utility closet at the end of the wing when he heard the change in the monitor sound. Not an alarm exactly, but the quality of it different. Urgent in a way that cut through the baseline noise of a hospital at night. He was out of the closet before he'd consciously decided to move. The sounds were coming from room 412. He was close, closer than the nursing station, closer than anyone at that moment except the boy's mother, who was in the chair beside the bed and who was now standing, frozen, her hand over her mouth, as her son went rigid and then limp and then rigid again. Seizure. Daniel was through the door in 3 steps. He clocked the situation in the way his training had built into him, the posture, the rhythm of the convulsion, the color around the boy's mouth, the oxygen saturation readout visible from where he stood. Dropping, he hit the call button on the wall panel. He spoke to the mother without looking at her. "Call out in the hallway," he said. "Loud as you can. Tell them it's a seizure in 412 and we need someone now." She blinked at him. He was in gray. He had a mop handle visible in the corridor behind him. "Go," he said. Not unkindly. "Clear." She went. Daniel moved to the bed. He did not think about what he wasn't supposed to do or what his employment status was or what Carl would say in the morning. He thought about the boy, 7 years old from the chart he could see on the screen, noted in the summary visible on the wall display. Complex presentation, high risk. The oxygen saturation was at 81 and dropping. He positioned the boy, cleared the airway, reached for the bedside equipment with hands that remembered everything they'd ever learned. His entire body had clicked into a mode that 11 months of quiet and cart pushing and cafeteria floor cleaning had not touched at all. The boy's airway opened. The saturation numbers paused, started to climb. The nursing team arrived 40 seconds later. Daniel stepped back. He was a facilities employee. He was not supposed to be at the bedside. He moved to the corner of the room and let them work, watching, tracking the readouts, his mouth closed. The neurology resident arrived 90 seconds after that. A young doctor, fast, competent, taking stock of the room and the patient and the readings. The seizure broke 4 minutes in. The boy lay still. His numbers stabilized. The room's collective exhale was almost audible. In the corridor, Nora Caldwell was standing with her back against the wall and her hands pressed flat against it on either side of her body. She was shaking. She was not a person who shook. Daniel came out a moment later. She looked at him. He had gray clothes and a utility badge and a cleaning cart still parked in the hallway. "What did you do?" she said. "Positioned him," he said. "Cleared the airway. He was going hypoxic." "How did you know to do that?" He considered the question. There were several answers. He gave the simplest one. "I've seen it before." She stared at him. Your maintenance." "That's right." She did not know what to do with this information. The shaking in her hands was still happening. She looked down at them as though they belonged to someone else. Daniel said, "He's stable. The team is with him. He came through it." She looked up. "How bad was it?" "It was significant." He chose the word carefully. "But he's through it." Her face did something complex. She had been a person who did not let things show, and she was still that person, but the machinery of it was visibly working harder than usual. She said, "What's your name?" "Daniel Reyes." She said, "Thank you, Daniel Reyes." He nodded. He picked up his cart. He went back to work. She asked about him the next morning. She was Nora Caldwell. She had people who found things. By noon, she had a summary of the basics: 11 months in facilities, prior employment listed as medical, appeal process ongoing with the state licensing board, no current clinical privileges. By 2 in the afternoon, she had a more detailed profile. By 3, she understood what she was looking at. She sat with this knowledge for a long time. In her office, she had kept the corner of an office at Harrington, the kind of arrangement money made possible. She looked out the window at the city and thought about what it meant that a pediatric AVM specialist had been pushing a mop cart 40 feet from her son's room. She thought about what it meant that she had looked at him the night before and seen only the gray uniform. She had built her life on the ability to identify talent, to recognize value, to understand what something was worth, regardless of what container it came in. She had taken companies that looked like losses and seen the assets underneath. She had hired people that other firms had passed over and watched them become essential. And she had looked at this man and seen a janitor. The fact of this sat inside her chest like something cold. She called her assistant. She said, "I need to speak with a man named Daniel Reyes. He works in facilities. Please find out his schedule." Her assistant asked no questions. This was why she was a good assistant. Daniel was in the 4th floor utility room at 4:15, inventorying cleaning supplies, when a woman in an expensive coat appeared in the doorway. He recognized her. He had recognized her the night before, but hadn't said so, because it wasn't relevant. She said, "I'd like to talk to you, if you have a moment." He did not have a moment in the traditional sense. Carl needed the inventory by 5, but he set down the clipboard. She said, "I know who you are." He waited. She said your name, your actual name. Not Daniel Reyes, the facilities employee. Daniel Reyes, neurovascular specialist, Johns Hopkins, Barcelona. 437 pediatric surgeries with an outcome record, that she cited from a journal abstract she had clearly read this morning. He was quiet. She said, "Why didn't you tell anyone?" He said, "It's not relevant to the job I have." She said, "You saved my son last night." He said, "The nursing team managed the seizure. I helped stabilize him until they arrived. You positioned him." She said it precisely. "You managed his airway. If you hadn't been in that room when you were, if you hadn't done what you did," Daniel said, "he might have been fine. Another 40 seconds and the team would have been there." She said, "Might." He said, "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I want to understand what happened to you, to your career, why you're here." Daniel looked at her steadily. "With respect, Miss Caldwell, that's not your business." She almost smiled. It was a small thing, quickly gone. "You're right, it isn't." She paused. "I'm going to tell you something anyway, and I want you to hear it as information, not as an offer or a negotiation, just facts." He waited. She said, "I have a significant relationship with this hospital's board. The chief administrator reports to a committee I chair through the Caldwell Foundation. When I identify resources that are being misused or held in the wrong position, I say so." He said, "I'm not a resource." She said, "No. You're a person who's had something unjust happen to him. And I am in the habit of fixing things that are unjust, when I can." He said, "Why?" She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the shelves of cleaning supplies behind him, at the mop leaning against the wall, at his hands, which were exactly what they were. "Because James is still up there," she said, "and I don't know if the next time will be like last night." He understood what she was not saying. He understood the anatomy of James's avum. He had read it, quietly, from the documentation visible on the room's wall screen the night before, the habit of 20 years impossible to stop. He understood what a second event might look like. He said, "I can't perform surgery. My privileges are suspended pending review." She said, "I know. I'm not asking you to perform surgery." She met his eyes. "I'm asking you to consult. Unofficially, to tell me what you see when you look at his imaging. Not as his doctor, just as someone who has seen this before." He was silent for a long time. She said, "My son likes dragons. He told me last night that the IV in his arm felt like a dragon's bite, but that dragons are cool, so it was okay." She said it evenly, but it cost her something. He's 7 years old. Daniel said, "I'll look at the imaging." He looked at it that evening, in a conference room that Nora had arranged access to through channels he didn't ask about. The scans were up on a display. James's avum in 3 dimensions, gray and white and precise, a tangle of vessels and territory that would have made most surgeons careful. Daniel studied it for a long time. He said, "The specialist who said no to surgery. Keller?" She said, "Yes." He said, "He's not wrong. The conventional approach has significant risks, the angle of access, the proximity to the eloquent cortex," she said, "but..." He looked at her. She had built $23 billion on the ability to hear the word that was coming after a sentence ended, the implication before it was spoken. He said, "There's been work. In the last 18 months, there's a technique. Endovascular first, targeted embolization of the feeder vessels, then surgical resection through a different approach vector. The numbers on pediatric cases at centers that have adopted it are significantly better than the conventional outcomes." She said, "Who's done it?" He said 2 names. One in Zurich, one in Houston, both colleagues he'd trained alongside, both working with the technique. She said, "Have you done it?" He said 61 times. His voice was even, 48 of which were in pediatric patients with deep-seated malformations. The room was very quiet. She said, "And James?" He looked at the scans again. He looked for a long time. He said, "If I were still practicing, if someone brought me this imaging and asked what I saw, I'd say the anatomy is difficult, but it is not the worst I've seen. The feeder vessel pattern is accessible. The approach vector I'd use is different from what Keller would have used. She paused. But that is academic, because I am not the surgeon, and this is not my call to make. She said, I'm not asking you to make it. He said, what are you asking? She said, I'm asking you to talk to Garrett, to tell her what you just told me. Officially or unofficially, however it needs to happen, to make sure that she has this information when she's making decisions about my son. He looked at her. She said, I know you don't owe me anything. I know I looked at you last night and saw the uniform. She didn't look away. I'm not going to apologize for it right now, because an apology right now would be about me, and I need this to be about James. Later, I will. But right now I'm asking you, as one parent to another, if you have children, help me. He was quiet. She said, do you have children? He said, a daughter. Emma, she's 5. She said, then you know. He said, yes. He picked up his phone and called Dr. Pauline Garrett. Doctor. Garrett's response to a facilities employee calling her personal cell at 7 p.m. to discuss a patient's imaging was not, initially, what either of them might have hoped for. She was curt. She was professional. She said, I'm aware of your background, Mr. Reyes. Your situation is complicated. I'd recommend speaking with the licensing board. Daniel said, I know. I'm not calling as a practitioner. I'm calling as someone who has seen this technique used successfully and who believes Dr. Tom. Keller may not be aware of the recent data. Garrett said, which technique? He told her. There was a silence. She said, the Sato-Reeves modification. He said, modified further since Sato-Reeves. The Zurich group published the current protocol 8 months ago. It wasn't widely circulated. She said, send me the citation. He sent it while she was still on the phone. She went quiet for 3 minutes. He could hear her reading. She said, the sample size is small. He said 62 patients over 20 months. All deep-seated pediatric AVMs, 79% complete resection. Complication rate significantly below the conventional approach for equivalent anatomy. She said, where have you used this? He told her about Barcelona. He told her the numbers. He told her 3 specific cases that were similar to James's presentation. She said, I'd like to see those case histories. He said, I can provide them through my prior institution's research records. He paused. I want to be clear about what I'm doing here. I'm providing information. I'm not making a recommendation as a practitioner. The decision about what to do with this information is entirely yours and the team's. She said, I understand. She was quiet for a moment. She said, you've been working in our facilities department for 11 months. He said, yes. She said, and you didn't say anything about any of this. He said, it wasn't my place. Another silence. Longer, she said, come in tomorrow morning. I want to discuss James Caldwell's case with you. Formally, as a consultant. Not as surgical team, I want to be clear about that, given your current status, but as an informational resource. I need to know what you know. He said, okay. She said, 8 o'clock. He said, I'll be there. He put the phone down. Nora was still in the room. She had heard his side of the conversation and was watching him with an expression he couldn't fully categorize. She said, she'll look at it? He said, she'll consider the information. She said, that's more than I've had in 3 weeks. He said, it may not go anywhere. She may review the data and conclude the risk-benefit analysis doesn't change. She said, I know. She met his eyes. But someone is looking at it now who might see something different. He said, Miss Caldwell. She said, Nora. He said, Nora, I need you to understand something. If Garrett decides to move forward, the surgeon performing the procedure will not be me. My situation doesn't change because of this. She said, I know. He said, I'm not asking for anything. She said, I know that too. She paused. Neither am I, except for you to tell Garrett everything you told me. He said, I will. She said, okay. She took a breath that was more complicated than it looked. Okay. She looked at the scans one more time. Then she said, my husband left when James was 3. He said I was always running somewhere else, always thinking about the next thing. He said I'd turned my whole life into a machine, and there was no room in it for anything that didn't move fast enough. Daniel said nothing. She said, I think he was right. I think I got very good at moving fast and very bad at seeing what was right in front of me. She looked at him. I'm trying to get better at that. He said, James seems like a good reason to keep trying. She said, yes. She picked up her bag. Yes, he is. Doctor, Garrett's meeting lasted 4 hours. By the time it ended, 2 other members of the neurology team had been pulled in. The case histories from Barcelona had been requested and partially reviewed. A video call had been arranged with the Zurich group for the following morning. Daniel sat in a conference room and answered questions for hours, with the straightforward precision of a person who had spent 20 years learning to be exactly clear about what he knew and what he didn't. At no point did anyone call him Dr. Reyes. He had not asked them to. That was not what this was. At one point, one of the neurology residents, young, sharp, clearly trying to understand why someone with this history was working in facilities, said, "Can I ask why you didn't?" Daniel said, "No." He said it evenly, without heat. "I appreciate the question, but it's not relevant to James Caldwell's care." The resident went back to the case histories. Dr. Garrett, at the end of the 4 hours, said, "I'm going to need a week." Daniel said, "That's reasonable." She said, "I'm bringing in someone from the Houston group to review the imaging independently." He said, "That's the right call." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "You're good at this. The consulting, the explaining." He said, "I had good teachers." She said, "So did I." She paused. "I'm going to make some calls about your appeal process. Not promises, just calls." She said it carefully, precisely. "There are people on the review board I know. I can make sure they have a complete picture." He said, "You don't have to do that." She said, "I know." She looked at him levelly. "But you drove 2 hours out of your way once in Barcelona to consult on a case that one of my former students was stuck on. He told me about it." She paused. "I've thought about it for years, actually, about what kind of surgeon does that." He said, "The case was interesting." She almost smiled. She said, "Go home. Let me work." He went home. His apartment was quiet. He called Emma. She answered on the first ring the way she always did, because she was 5 and did not yet have the defense mechanisms that would come later. She said, "Daddy, did you have a good day?" He said, "Yeah, Em, I think I had a pretty good day." She told him about her preschool project. They were making a map of where everybody's families came from, and she had put a star on Mexico for his mother's family, and a star on Texas for his father's, and a third star on New York, because that was where she visited him, which was important. He said, "That sounds like a good map." She said, "I put a really big star on New York." He said, "I saw that in my mind. It looks great." She laughed. "You can't see it." He said, "No, but I know what your stars look like. They've got that extra point on the side." She said, "That's the secret point. You have to know to look for it." He said, "I always look for it." They talked until she needed to go to bed. After he hung up, he sat in the apartment in the dark for a little while, thinking about secret points on stars and the particular way that good things sometimes hid themselves in places you weren't looking. The week that followed was not quiet. The Houston surgeon arrived and spent 2 days with James's imaging. He and Daniel had known each other from a conference 4 years ago. The neurovascular world was small, the people in it closely connected. They walked the scans together in a way that looked to any observer like a colleague conversation, a peer review of images. The Houston surgeon said, "You think the posterolateral approach." Daniel said, "With the modified feeder embolization first." Yes, the Houston surgeon said, "The Zurich numbers are promising." Daniel said, "They are." The Houston surgeon said, "You've done this more than anyone outside of Zurich." Daniel said, "Yes." A silence. The Houston surgeon said, "Your situation is absurd for what it's worth." Daniel said, "It is what it is." The Houston surgeon said, "When's the board reviewing?" Daniel said, 6 weeks. He said, "I'll make a call." He said it simply. He looked at the scans. He said, "This boy's anatomy is not the worst I've seen." With the right approach, Daniel said, "I know." He said, "I'm going to recommend the procedure." Daniel said, "I think that's the right call." He said, "Will you be in the room?" Daniel said, "No, that's not possible right now." He looked at him for a moment. He said, "I'll want you as close to the room as legally permissible." Daniel said, "I can arrange that." Nora found him in the hallway the day after the Houston surgeon made his recommendation. She was different than she had been. Not soft, she was still Nora Caldwell, still someone whose presence reorganized a room around her. But something had adjusted. Some layer of the armor had moved. She said, Garrett told me, "They're recommending the surgery." He said, "I know." She said, "The Houston surgeon is going to lead, Garrett assisting." She paused. "They told me about your involvement, how it started." She was looking at him carefully. "You didn't come to me with this. You didn't come to Garrett. You just answered questions." He said, "I wasn't there to offer surgical consulting." She said, "But you were there." He said, "Yes." She said, "In the right place." He let that sit. She said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that the answer doesn't change anything I'm doing. This isn't a negotiation." He waited. She said, "Why didn't you tell anyone? That you were a surgeon? That you knew things?" She was genuinely asking, not accusatory, just asking. "Why did you push a cart for 11 months and say nothing?" Daniel thought about how to answer this. He said, "Because it wasn't mine to say." He paused. "I lost my clinical privileges. That's the situation. I didn't lose them because I harmed someone. You can probably find that out if you look. But the situation is the situation." He looked at her directly. "I'm not a surgeon right now. I'm a man who used to be a surgeon. Telling people what I used to be doesn't help anyone." She said, "It helped James." He said, "You helped James. You noticed something was wrong. You brought him here. You pushed until someone listened." He paused. "I just knew how to position a child during a seizure." She said, "You did a great deal more than that." He said, "Maybe." She said, "Not maybe." She said it firmly, "Not maybe." She looked at him for a moment. "I am going to tell you something now, and I want you to hear it as the plain truth and not as a rich woman trying to buy her way out of feeling guilty." He said, "Okay." She said, "I was wrong. The night you were at his door, I saw you and I dismissed you before you spoke. Because of what you were wearing, because of what your job title was, because of how the world had arranged you in that moment." She said it without flinching. "And I have been wrong in this way before, with other people, in other rooms, not just that night." She said, "I am sorry." He said, "I know." She said, "That's it?" He said, "What else should I say?" He wasn't unkind. He was simply direct. You see something about yourself and you're correcting for it. That's what people do when they want to be better. He paused. "You could have done nothing. You saw who I was and you started asking questions anyway. A lot of people wouldn't have." She said, "Most people don't have a child with an AVM." He said, "No. But the instinct you followed, to look past the surface, that instinct was already there. The emergency just made you use it." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "James wants to meet you." He said, "You told him?" She said, "I told him that the man who helped him the other night wants to stop by." He said, she almost smiled, he said, Is he a doctor or a dragon? Daniel said, Those are the options? She said, apparently. He said, I can stop by after my shift. She said, 4 o'clock? He said, 4 o'clock. James Caldwell was small in the hospital bed and entirely himself. He had a dragon book open across his lap, the same chapter book Nora had mentioned. He looked at Daniel when he came in with the focused assessment of a 7-year-old taking the full measure of a new person. He said, Are you the man who fixed my breathing? Daniel said, I helped for a minute. The doctors did the actual fixing. James considered this. He said, Mom says you have special hands. Daniel looked at his hands. He said, Everyone's hands have things they know how to do. James held up his own hands. He said, My hands know how to draw dragons. He paused. And to tie shoes, but that's not as cool. Daniel said, I disagree. Shoe tying is underrated. James considered this with great seriousness. He said, What do your hands know how to do? Daniel said, They know how to be careful. He said it simply, how to be very careful when something matters. James seemed satisfied with this answer. He said, The doctor said I'm going to have a surgery. Daniel said, I heard that. James said, Are you going to be there? Daniel said, I'm going to be nearby. James thought about this. He said, Is nearby good enough? Daniel said, It's going to have to be. He said it gently. But nearby in a hospital is closer than it sounds. James accepted this. He went back to his dragon book. Then, without looking up, he said, I like your hands. You can tell they know careful things. Daniel looked at his hands again. He said, Thank you, James. James turned a page. The surgery happened on a Tuesday. Daniel was in the corridor outside the surgical wing for 6 hours. He was not supposed to be there. Carl had given him the day off. There was something in Carl's eyes when he said it that suggested Carl knew more than Carl let on. That Carl had always known more than Carl let on. That Carl was the kind of man who moved quietly through institutions and understood everything happening in them. Daniel stood in the corridor. A nurse he knew from the 4th floor brought him coffee at hour 2. A resident who had been in the consulting meeting nodded at him when he passed at hour 4. Nobody made him leave. At hour 6, Dr. Garrett came through the surgical doors. She saw him. She said, We got it. The words were simple. Complete resection. No intraoperative complications. The feeder embolization had gone as planned. The approach vector had been as predicted. The boy had come through. Daniel's hands were flat against the corridor wall, and he was looking at the ceiling, and his throat was doing something complicated. Doctor, Garrett said, the Houston surgeon says the approach you suggested was exactly right. He said, he's the one who executed it. She said, yes, but you see things clearly. He was quiet. She said, the board called me this morning. She said it matter-of-factly. Your appeal has been moved to next week. New documentation has come in from multiple sources. The committee chair says it looks favorable. He said, what did you do? She said, I made some calls. He said, Garrett. She said, don't thank me. You spent 11 months pushing a cart in my hospital and never once complained. That's not something I could do. She said it was something that might have been wonder. It takes a particular kind of discipline to know who you are and wait. He said, I didn't feel like I had a choice. She said, everyone has a choice about how they wait. She went back through the doors. Daniel stood in the corridor for a while longer. The coffee was cold. He drank it anyway. The 2 months that followed moved differently than the previous 11. The board review went as Garrett had said. The committee had received documentation from 3 independent sources attesting to Daniel's history, his record, the circumstances of the accident, and its aftermath. The reinstatement was no longer conditional. The conditions had been reviewed and found insufficient. He was cleared to practice. He was offered his position back by a hospital in Manhattan, not Harrington, a different one, a smaller one that had been looking for exactly what he was. He accepted. He started in December. He told Carl before he told anyone else. Carl shook his hand with the grip of someone who had been waiting for good news and received it without surprise. Carl said, "We're going to miss you on the 4th floor." Daniel said, "I'm going to miss the 4th floor." Carl said, "You were good at it. For what it's worth. The job. You always saw what needed doing." Daniel said, "I learned that here." Carl looked at him for a moment. He said, "My nephew went to medical school. Didn't work out. Drives a truck now. He's a good driver." He paused. "I always thought that was the wrong ending, that story." Daniel said, "Maybe the story isn't over." Carl said, "Maybe not." He cleaned out the utility closet he'd used for 11 months. It didn't take long. He didn't own much here. He left the inventory in good order, labeled and counted, the way he'd found it. He stopped by room 412 on his last day in facilities. It was a different patient now. James had been discharged 2 weeks after the surgery, walking and talking and holding his dragon book and asking the discharge nurse if the hospital had any dragons they knew of. The room was quiet. Daniel stood in the doorway for a moment. He thought about the night of the seizure, about the decision that wasn't a decision, the body already moving before the mind had processed the question, about what it meant that 20 years of training didn't go anywhere, didn't diminish or dissolve, just waited in the hands like a held breath. He said goodbye to the empty room. He went home and called Emma. She answered on the first ring. She said, "Daddy." He said, "Hi, Em. I have news." She said, "Good news or the other kind?" He said, "The best kind." She was quiet for a moment, with the particular quiet of a 5-year-old computing something important. She said, "Are you coming home?" He said, "I'm already home. But I'm going to be doing the thing I used to do again. The hands thing." She said, "The careful thing?" He said, "That's right. The careful thing." She said, "I'm glad." She said it simply, with the directness of a child who had not yet learned to make good news complicated. "I always knew your hands were for the careful thing." He said, "I know. You've said that." She said, "Because it's true." He said, "Yes." She said, "Daddy?" He said, "Yeah?" She said, "I want to visit with a dragon book. A new one. We can read it together when you get home from the hospital." He said, "Deal." She said, "A really long one." He said, "As long as you want." He sat with the phone long after the call ended, in the apartment that was too quiet, that would be quieter still for a few more weeks until Emma's next visit. The city outside was doing what it always did, moving, louder than reason, indifferent and magnificent. He thought about Nora Caldwell. She had sent him a message 2 weeks after James's discharge. 2 sentences. James finished the chapter book. He says, "The dragon wins." He had written back, "They usually do, if you give them enough pages." She had sent a single word back, "Exactly." He didn't know what the future of that particular connection looked like. He thought it might become something, an acquaintance that didn't have a clean category, built from a strange night and a hard week and the particular intimacy of having been in the right place. Or it might not become anything more than what it already was, a moment when 2 people saw each other clearly. Either way, he had been seen. That was enough. That was more than enough. 6 months later, on a Saturday morning in April, Daniel was in an operating room at St. Clement's Hospital in Manhattan. The case was a 9-year-old girl. AVM, deep-seated, posterolateral approach indicated. Her parents were in the corridor. He had spoken with them for 40 minutes the day before. They were afraid, which was the right response, which was what love looked like when the thing it was attached to was in danger. He had told them what he knew, what the numbers said, what his hands had learned to do and how long they had been learning it. The father had shaken his hand and held on for a moment. He was a man in work clothes who drove a bus and had been at the hospital every day for 2 weeks. He said, "I don't know how to thank you." Daniel said, "You don't need to thank me yet. Wait until after." The father said, "I'll thank you now too, just in case." Daniel said, Okay. Now he was in the room, the case was open, and the work was exactly what it had always been. Precise and slow, and requiring the whole of what he had become across 1,000 hours of practice and failure and refinement. His hands moved carefully. The way hands move when they remember what they were made for. The monitors were steady. The team was steady. Outside in the corridor, a father in work clothes was keeping vigil the way fathers do, measuring time in breaths and ceiling tiles, in the particular hope that does not diminish even when it has no good reason to continue. It took 5 hours. It went exactly as planned. When Daniel came out, the father stood up before the door had fully opened. He was already searching Daniel's face, reading it the way people read things they need to understand, but cannot wait to be told. Daniel said, "She's going to be fine." The father put both hands over his face. His shoulders moved. Daniel stood there. He did not say anything else. Some moments don't need anything else. He walked to the window at the end of the corridor. The city was bright outside, spring light on the buildings, people on the sidewalk moving through their ordinary days. His phone buzzed. A message from Emma. She had sent a picture of her map, the one from preschool, now hanging on her bedroom wall. Stars on Mexico and Texas and New York, the New York one very large, with an extra point on the side. The secret point. He looked at it for a long time. He sent back a star he drew with his thumb. Lopsided, clumsy on the small screen, with an extra point. 3 seconds later, she sent back, "I see it." He put the phone in his pocket. Down the corridor, the father was on his phone now, voice low, calling someone, the other parent maybe, or grandparents, or a sibling, saying the thing that everyone who has waited like this has said in some form or another when the news is good. She's okay. She's going to be okay. Daniel stood at the window a while longer. He thought about a hallway on a Thursday night in October, about a boy in a hospital bed going blue, about a pair of hands that had spent 11 months learning to be patient, learning to be still, learning to trust that what they carried would be needed again. The city went on being the city. Somewhere across it, James Caldwell was probably reading a dragon book. Nora Caldwell was probably running something. More carefully now, he thought. More willing to look at what was right in front of her. Emma had school on Monday. He was going to pick her up himself for the first time in 2 years. He was going to be on time. He turned from the window. There was more work to do, the kind that had no end and required everything, and was, when he was honest, exactly what he had always wanted. Work that mattered. Work that asked him to be the most careful version of himself. His hands at his sides. Steady, ready, the hallway waited.